Thank you very much, Peter, for the invitation and the kind introduction. I was going to talk about measuring a democracy, and I would like to focus on international commitments and obligations for various reasons. Before I do that, I would like just to give you a short overview of what I was going to talk. I think I will talk about 20 minutes. I hope it won't be longer than that, so we have enough time for discussions and questions. My presentation is structured along two questions: why measuring a democracy, how to measure democracy. And then I would like to come to the answer. I mean, part of the answer, relevant international commitments and obligations, and at the end I would like to offer some conclusions and maybe recommendations. Before I do that, I just wanted to introduce you to Democracy Reporting International, which is an NGO based in Berlin, founded in 2006. And what we do is we mostly work in the Middle East and North Africa, assessing election frameworks and democracies in the region. And now we have also extended our area of activity to Pakistan. So I'll give you a short overview where we have worked over the last 4 years. That's Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, Yemen, Jordan, Lebanon, and now a rather big project in Pakistan. But I don't want to bore you so much with Democracy Reporting International and jump into the presentations right away. The question is, I mean, why do we actually measure democracies? I mean, there are also a number of challenges towards that question. And number one is, I guess, that many people say democracies come in so many different forms. I mean, there are so many different models of democracy, it makes it impossible to measure. And every single model or setup of a democracy is, in fact, a sovereign decision of a nation state. So why do we actually bother as another actor, international actor, to measure a democracy? That is, of course, often a challenge or an argument presented by a regime that I would consider authoritarian or semi-authoritarian. But nevertheless, I guess it's a fair challenge to cope with the diversity of democracies that we find around the globe. So I guess there are three challenges at least. Maybe there are more. I'm happy to discuss them with you later this morning. But my response would be to these challenges. Well, first of all, isn't democracy and good governance a precondition for development? I mean, that is something I would like to present as a question. From my point of view, it is empirically, to a large extent, a precondition for development as such. I mean, if you look at the OSCE countries, you will see that these are developing more sustainably than many other countries. And of course, that's something we could discuss after my presentation. What about China? That is, I guess, the white elephant in the room. Isn't that something that we should pursue, and isn't that a serious challenge for democracy? There's another question, or another reason, thank you, why we actually measure democracies. And that is, if you look at numerous development aid arrangements, agreements, you will see that there are conditionalities. There are conditions to certain achievements in good governance, normally also democracy, so that the recipient country meets certain democracy or good governance standards. So if we look at that, of course, we need to measure a democracy. I mean, what is it? I mean, is that condition met or not? And that also requires us to measure a democracy. And there's another item I would say that is international organizations. Some of them have a mandate or the objective to promote democracies, and for these organizations, obviously, it's inevitable to measure a democracy. And also there are some organizations, including the EU, that require members to be a democracy. So again, that requires us to measure a democracy. And the last point I would like to make here is election observation versus democracy assessment. I mean, maybe that is something unknown to many of you. I mean, we have a long record of democracy election observation, actually beginning in the early 90s, when elections as such were observed. But now I think it is really time that we move away from elections. I mean, elections are a crucial moment in a democracy. Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, a democracy consists of much more than only an election. So when we want to assess a democracy, we also need an understanding that goes beyond elections. And finally, to the question why to measure a democracy, I would argue there are international commitments and obligations that relate to democratic governance. So many countries have ratified international treaties, for example, the International Convention on Civil Political Rights, that includes commitments, or no, I should say obligations related to democratic governance. And I come to that in a moment. I should say that I make a difference between obligations and commitment. For me, an obligation is rather something stemming from a legal agreement, while a commitment is something that comes from a political agreement. And also, I should say that there are many actors out there that measure democracies. Probably most of you know Freedom House, who have developed an index measuring democracies. They have even ranked democracies, and they have a methodology that works along civil liberties and political rights and introduces a number of questions. And depending how this question is actually answered, a given country gets a certain ranking. And then they come up with an average ranking, and that is why they produce this map. I'm sure most of you know this map. I'm happy to discuss the value of the methodology with you and the value of ranking democracies. I personally am rather skeptical of that. But coming back to the question of commitments and obligations, or the question why we actually, or how we measure a democracy. And when we answer the question how to measure a democracy, of course we need some type of benchmark. I mean, what is the benchmark against we measure a democracy? And one benchmark is what I offer here with the quote from the Human Rights Commission that declares essential elements of a democracy, which include human rights, fundamental freedom, rule of law, elections, pluralistic system, independence of judiciary, transparency, and free media. So there's a number of criteria that has been adopted by this body that is mandated to interpret an international treaty. And I would argue that this interpretation is in fact already an authoritative interpretation of that treaty. And it helps us to understand the meaning of the treaty and is a quite detailed and helpful way to understand these obligations. And then there are, of course, a number of General Assembly resolutions that also define or put on the table a number of key features that every democracy has to meet. And I would like to underline that these Assembly resolutions have been approved, for example, by 172 countries for Resolution 5596, or in the similar number of member states has approved General Assembly Resolution 62.7, which declares democracy as such as a universal value. So I guess we have a pretty solid benchmark already from this, but I would argue that there is even more detailed commitments and obligations concerning democratic governance that has been ratified by almost all countries around the globe. But I mean, when we measure a democracy, I mean, I guess there would be a number of key problems or accusations. One is, of course, and that is something we face very often as human rights activists, that countries would tell us, well, I mean, you don't understand the country context, you don't understand our history, you don't understand our traditions, and what you use here are double standards. In fact, you apply your own benchmark, and it's not our benchmark. So that is one challenge we need to take very seriously. But my response would be, and I already implied that, that there are a number of rules which are very detailed and accepted by virtually all countries. And along the lines of the General Assembly resolution, democracy has developed into something like a universal value. And of course, as I said, there are international standards and obligations and commitments rather than standards. And I come to these now. On On the left-hand column, you see what I call obligation. On the right-hand column, commitments. I already mentioned the international treaties, International Convention on Civil Political Rights, which has been ratified by 166 countries, and these countries include places like Afghanistan or Zimbabwe. So, and then you have, I mean, I picked these two because Afghanistan starts with an A and Zimbabwe starts with a Z. So you have virtually most countries in between these two. I mean, there are a number of exceptions, but 166 out of 192 countries around the globe is it's a very substantial number. Then you have regional agreements, the African Charter of Human and People's Rights, American Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and for the EU there are specific commitments as well. I don't need to explain this in further detail, I assume. And on the other hand, there are political commitments. I mean, you could argue whether the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as such is a political commitment or already customary law. I'll leave that to you. Regardless of the legal value of that declaration, we already have the international treaties, which are beyond doubt legally binding. Then there are a number of specific commitments for the OSCE area, or there's a Warsaw Declaration on Community of Democracy, and there are a number of General Assembly resolutions. So you have, in fact, and I need to underline this, a number of very solid commitments and obligations that have been accepted by a great number of countries. So going into more detail, I would like to highlight one key obligation under the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and that is Article 25. For our work at Democracy Reporting International, that is basically our benchmark, it's our Bible, if you wish. I mean, that's our key reference point for our work. And it calls, for example, for general and periodic elections, equal suffrage, guaranteeing the free expression of the will of the electors. So that is, I guess, a key feature of that article, and it really helps a lot assessing or measuring a democracy, because when we measure democracy along these lines, according to these provisions, we don't introduce our own benchmark, but we apply what has been accepted by all those countries involved. And I should say that provision, of course, as such is pretty broad, but it has been specified in much more detail through general comments. So I invite you, I mean, if you go to the website of the treaty, you will see that basically every single treaty provision, every single provision has been spelled out in more detail through general comments. And these are an authoritative interpretation of these provisions, help us greatly to understand the meaning of these provisions. And also there are case law that fleshes out in further detail what we have at the pretty general level. I guess it's not really so new for some of you if I talked about election-related obligations, but I would also argue there are further obligations that are important for measuring a democracy, and that is that there are legal requirements in terms of, regarding separation of power. So that that is something that is quite often actually challenged, that the constitutional setup of a country, it is something that is exclusively within the discretion of this country. Well, in case the country has signed international treaties, that is not true as such. I mean, we have, I mean, that is quite obvious, independence of the judiciary. That is also about separation of power. But also, and that is quite important, I would say, we have rules that regulate the relationship between the legislative and the executive. For example, Article 25, human rights country reports, or the Copenhagen documents. And they all talk about that there should not be any over-concentration of power in the executive, that the parliament needs to have a certain minimum rights. For example, it is explicit in the Copenhagen documents that parliament is entitled to schedule sessions, to adopt rules of procedures. So it's not within the country's discretion to say, well, the government calls a session of parliament. It needs to be within the discretion of parliament just to stick to the rules that the country has accepted. There are also minimum accountability rules. For example, if you have a two-chamber system in the country, at least one chamber needs to be directly elected by the voter. And that is something that's explicit in the general comments or in the Copenhagen documents. And now, I made the difference between obligations and commitments. There are also a number of commitments, for example, for the OSCE countries that refer to honest count, that results officially published, free campaigning, or election observation. That is also something very important, that election observation as such is a commitment that OSCE countries have accepted. It's different in other regions of the world, but for the OSCE there is a political commitment that every single participating state has accepted the obligation or the commitment to invite observers. You have talked about this extensively during this conference, that there's a number of political rights that also make up a democracy and that also help us to measure democracies. And you're all aware that these are enshrined in these treaties: freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought, and effective remedies, to name a few examples. And these are further spelled out in more detail for the OSCE, for example, but you also find this in general comments for the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which is a universal instrument.
Could you just go back 2 slides? I missed something that I thought was interesting. Honest court.
Count.
Oh, count. I'm sorry. Official results made public access.
Honest count, yeah. The honest court is something also quite helpful. Yeah. So, if I draw a couple of conclusions, I would say that democracy as such is a universal value which is already fleshed out in some detail. Certainly we can discuss a number of features that are questionable, but as a minimum requirement, democracy is a universally accepted value as such. And I would say that is also an international consensus. For me, a treaty and an international consensus are virtually the same. So I would say we don't have to move toward a consensus, but rather we have to reconfirm, or we have to implement what is already consensus in this regard. I would argue that there's less need for renegotiating existing norms, but rather for implementation of what we have. If we had implemented every single norm, there's agreement, then this world would be a much better place. So, as I said, there's minimum requirements for democratic government, and also I would underline that there is no specific model as such advocated by international obligations or commitments. So there's no requirement to adopt, for example, the proportional system versus the majoritarian system. That doesn't exist in international. That is left to countries to determine this, but international law and obligations include a number of minimum requirements. And that is also true for separation of power. And I would argue that whenever we want to evade the accusation that we are introducing our own standards, well, please refer to what has been accepted by virtually all countries. And that is what I would also recommend for the way forward, that there should be, in fact, a stronger focus on international commitments and obligations. That is not a legalistic point of view, and I would also say that it's not naive, but it's also, it's a very important tool that contributes to supporting democracies across the world. And that also requires greater awareness. I see that, for example, a number of election observers reports don't refer to international obligations, and I find that quite disappointing, because if we don't make this reference, we lose a very important benchmark and a very strong instrument, and we shouldn't do that. And also, when we measure a democracy, we should not make the mistake that we focus on elections as such. Elections are a key moment in a democracy, as I said, but there's much more, and judiciary and a strong parliament are key features as well. What does it help if we vote for a parliament that is very weak, that is basically only rubber stamping what a king or a president has adopted? So When we measure democracy, I think separation of power and a meaningful parliament and a strong and independent judiciary are key features for our assessment. And finally, that is something maybe also for this afternoon when we have the panel discussion, I would like to see, greater cooperation between what some call human rights in a narrow sense and democracy's support. Because in fact, this is two sides of the same coin. There's no human rights without democracy and vice versa. And this has been, I guess, to some extent tarnished after 9/11 when the American administration used the term democracy extensively, and I was wondering to what extent this really has helped our purposes. Okay, I leave it here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meyer-Ohlendorf. I'd suggest that people would raise their hands and try and get my attention, and then I'll, Alan.
Is it on?
You have to hit the button.
Oh, press the button, okay. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and informative. I was just curious, you've done election monitoring, and then they've done assessments about how democratic certain countries are. And I saw Morocco in there, it was in yellow. Morocco is a monarchy. To what extent do they have, what can you tell me about Morocco? To what extent do they have, are they considered democratic?
Questions or?
Let's turn to we'll say 3 at a time.
Thank you very much. I'm Irambo from Congo. I don't want to rob anybody's time here, so I will be very short in my questions. We heard a lot about transparency issue. My question is, what is really transparency is, and that monitoring what and in the interest of whose? Thank you.
Excuse me. Well, I have more than one, more than two, and in fact, more than 3 questions. Can I ask all of them, or should I ask? All right. Now, thank you for your presentation, first and foremost. Now, I'd like to start by asking you how you define democracy. Because you listed the essentials of democracy as explained by the Human Rights Council. Now, if you look at those essentials, they do not include what I consider the very essence of democracy, which is popular sovereignty and popular participation in governance. There's no indication there or in any other definition of democracy anywhere that includes the right of people actually to be involved in their government. And that is what democracy is or should be. So how do you now define democracy? That is one question. The second question has to do with Article 25 of the ICPR that provides for the right of peoples to be involved in the elections of their leaders and to also be available to be elected if they wish. Now, that provision, the HRC, that's the Human Rights Committee or Commission, if you like, has ruled in a case called R against Marshall that that provision gives no right to anybody to participate in governance. It is simply a right to vote and be voted for in elections to elect the governors of their state. So that will not be in conformity again with the essence of democracy, which is popular participation and popular sovereignty. I don't know what to think about that. Number 3, if I may, You mentioned that one of the essentials of democracy is division of powers between the executive and the judiciary. Do you not think that this principle is routinely breached by many systems we call democracies? For example, in particular, the parliamentary system of governance, where, as you know, the executive powers and the legislative powers are fused in one. For example, in the UK, where I come from, the executive and the legislature are the same, no difference.
Yeah, but that's not what you're saying.
And then, well, final one, I think. You mentioned there's a global consensus on democracy, which means there should not now be any further discussions on what it is. We should accept as settled the notion as currently practiced. Now, wouldn't that be intellectual laziness on our part if we simply say there's no more room for discussion, that everything is now settled, when you consider that the so-called consensus only concerns the right to vote in elections and to have institutions, judiciary, and so on and so forth? Now, this does not include the right of people to be involved in the governance. It is simply a consensus on what we call representative governance. I think I'll leave it there for the moment. So,
yeah, I just wanted to amplify on the last point that you made about
yes.
the participation of the people, because, you know, I always find it ironic, and I talk to my constitutional law students about this, you know, America being the beacon of democracy, and we don't have compulsory voting. And to what extent does compulsory voting enhance democratic values? And, you know, America, with all due respect, was founded by white, wealthy, male property slave owners, and to a certain extent, the people who vote in America is a very limited proportion of eligible voters, and in presidential elections, it's 52% of registered voters. And if there were compulsory voting in the United States, I don't even think there'd be a Republican Party. I don't think it would exist. But because so many people have been disenfranchised, and there are the haves and the have-nots, and if you look at the salaries of the senators and the members of parliament, I think something like 96% are millionaires of senators, and it's over 90% in the House of Representatives, and they're controlled by large lobby groups. So to what extent are people really participating? They're not. They're disenfranchised. So you've got the haves and the have-nots, and and the gap is widening. So is this democracy?
Yeah, if I may simply help you out, 1 second or 1 minute.
I think Lance, I'd like us to give the speaker an opportunity to answer the questions that have been asked. You're happy? Okay.
Yeah, that point you made, simply to amplify it even further. Now, in the last elections in the UK, well, not even the last, even before the last one, Tony Blair, when he won election, he got 32% of the votes. And the turnout for the election was 64% of the electorate. Now, 32% of 64%, I don't know mathematics a lot, but that will give you less than 20% of the people. And he claimed to have the mandate of the people to rule. Less than 20% of the people. Is that what we call democracy?
Okay, thank you very much. I should stress, I mean, I talked about international commitments and obligations as such. I did not talk about implementation of these commitments. So concerning the question, the UK or US, I mean, this is the interesting part of it, of course, is to what extent have they implemented the commitments. And I don't want to comment on this here at this point because I don't know, I mean, the details of what you just raised. So that is my response to this, that we already have a framework in place that is pretty detailed, and we should be happy about this, or quite proud of it. And we should not make the mistake and say, well, I mean, we need to renegotiate all this what we already have. If we do this, I'm pretty sure that we risk opening Pandora's box here, and we open a can of worms, and I'm not sure whether we win anything. So we should be very precise. On the one hand, we should talk about commitments and obligations that exist. On the other hand, we need to talk and discuss implementation of these. These are two different things. Concerning the question of Morocco, is Morocco a democratic country? It is in yellow, yes. It is in yellow put by Freedom House. It is put in yellow largely because compared to other countries in the region, Morocco enjoys a greater liberal environment, I would say. At the same time, Morocco is certainly not a democracy as such. I mean, for the reason that parliament that is elected there has very limited power, and the final say always rests with the king. So for that question. The question on transparency and how to monitor transparency, I'm not sure whether I understood this question correctly. Maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to know that when we speak transparency, what we really mean, because transparency, who has access to that transparency? Because the activities of government in general are limited to a certain number of people, and the population generally are sometimes surprised by what happened.
That is a very good point, at least from an international point of view, because if you look at the international commitments, I would argue that transparency is one of the areas that needs further improvement when we talk about the framework and the obligation that could be improved. For example, there is very limited rules on campaign financing. That is something that is pretty difficult to measure, because if you want to refer to international commitments obligations, you will find very little. And same is true for counting. There is something on counting, but that could be more detailed, I would argue. And it's a key problem. If you look at elections like in Kenya, the count was the moment when violence erupted. So the count, aggregation of results, is a key moment in any election. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. The problem is.
Yeah.
Don't often report the real reality of those elections, for example. That's why I have a question about that, the transparency in reality. If there is real transparency or just formal.
Then of course, what do you mean by real transparency? I guess that is a very difficult question to answer in general. I would be happy if we had more detailed benchmarking from the international side there, but we don't. So, that is something I guess we measure more case by case. So, we could make an argument more on a reasonable ground, but it's difficult to say, well, if you introduce this campaign funding provision, for example, then this might be infringing with international commitments, because there's very little on that. But you would have to refer to the law of that country, which might regulate campaign funding, for example, or election observation. So, but just a second. There's more questions from you. How to define a democracy? I didn't attempt to define a democracy as such. What I did is I tried to present what has been accepted as minimum benchmarks requirements for democracy. There are some key features. And I would agree with you that, for me, the key feature, or the nitty-gritty, the most important feature is that those in power are happy to accept defeat and are ready to accept defeat, that in an election or in other ways the the people can choose a new government if they wish to do that. So that is the essential, and that is enshrined in Article 25. So that is already there. So if you look, where is it? Guaranteeing the, if you look at Article 25, B, it reads guaranteeing the free expression of the will of the electors. So I would say that this is for the elections there. There was another question, to what extent legislative and executive are the same. It's true for a parliamentary system that government rests on the majority in parliament. That means that there are many interlinkages between these two. And majority in parliament tends to support government, of course, because these are the people they have put into government. But at the same time, this doesn't mean they're the same. There are numerous cases, like for this room here, this is the committee room of the Bundestag. I've been here several times, and I've seen that the party supporting government, asked a tricky question, might not support the government. It's not the rule, of course, but it happens. So just by that, it's not the same. It's a big difference between a state and a government functionary who has to follow the orders by his minister, or a parliamentarian who has his or her own discretion.
I'd like to allow some of the people waiting with questions to... this lady, you were first, actually. Would you like to?
Thank you. My name is Anastasia, and I come from Belarus. And my question will be less philosophical, more practical, about the election observations. I just want to share my own experience during previous elections, how actually expressing the will of electors was challenged. Like, all the students living in the dorms were forced to vote in advance, and the ballot box is left unattended during the night. So how do observers deal with this? And then my own experience, I come to vote close to the time when the this place closes, so it was like 6 in the evening, and by 7 it's supposed to be closed. And there was already a tick next to my name, which meant that I already voted, and there were observers present in there. So I just wonder how it's going to be this time, because we have elections in the 19th of December coming quite soon. And what can actually observers do? How can they challenge all this abuse of the system? Thank you.
Yes, I would like to ask only a small thing. That is, how do we define benchmark, and whether there is any relation with this transparency? Whether that transparency means activity of the people, or financing expenses, or to make it transparent all the expenses that has been made by the government, in which way or that way it goes. That I like to get clarification.
Okay. Okay.
2 more, is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
I have one question. I'm wondering that if instead of trying to define democracy, it will be not easier to say that there is a set of rules and there are some rights that a state has to protect and ensure, because this state has signed international treaties, and in case of violation, people can ask for a remedy, and that there are some universal rules because they derived from treaties or international customary rules, and there is no need sometimes for a state to abide by a treaty, but because of the nature of the rule is customary law, the state has to protect it. And I think that it will be better for the understanding. For example, I'm from Senegal. It will be better for me to talk about a certain right deriving from international customary law than talking to me about principles that I have to defend, but I don't know how.
My question is about transparency, and how would you react to Tony Blair's statement that his passage of the Freedom for Information Act in the UK was the biggest mistake of his career?
I mean, the last question is, I will start with that. I mean, I simply don't know enough about it, so I'm sorry I cannot comment on this now. On the questions, I mean, what can observers do? What observers do is they observe. And that is important. They don't, I mean, they should not do anything else but observe. They should not interfere in the process, and that is within their mandate. So what they do, they observe, and they put their observation in a report. So you could argue, well, this is a meaningless piece of paper, and it has a little impact. And that is true for some observation missions, that is reports that are going by unnoticed. But at the same time, there are some reports, I mean, I just recall two examples, I mean, from your region, I mean, Ukraine or Georgia, not your region, but I mean, Ukraine, where the reports had a huge impact on the outcome of the elections. So, I mean, the Ukraine, I mean, the Orange Revolution or the Rose Revolution, they were quoting and quoting and quoting again the international observers reports. So these were fundamental documents in the process. So and that is an example where election observation had a very strong impact on the process. Concerning your example, I mean, yes, I mean, the ballot box was unguarded overnight. That should not happen, of course, and then observers should make a comment on that. But I'm sure all of us have some kind of incident like that to report. In how to define a benchmark, well, there are different ways of different types of benchmarks. What I talked about are benchmarks that are mutually accepted by those involved in the process. And that is either a political commitment or a legal obligation. And we are talking not about benchmarks that we accept. Like, I mean, if very often I hear, well, the French, I mean, they have a very strong president, and the US has a very strong president too, and so and you are coming and tell me we should not have a king. That is not the argument I'm making. The argument I make is, well, this is what you have accepted, and I ask you to live up to your own promises and obligations.
Yeah, but
and just a second. And then the final question I understood your question that, I mean, how do you react if, when there is a violation of international law or other provisions? Is that the question you were raising, or?
Actually, it's a bit talking, finding the definition of democracy in international customary law.
Okay, that's the point. I mean, I was talking about the ICCPR a lot because that is a legally binding instrument, no doubt. So it's ratified, and it's, I mean, like a key example of what is considered to be legally binding. So we don't have to discuss this, full stop. When we talk about customary law and democracy, and we could refer to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, and then you could argue that that is already part of customary law. There are different scholars, I mean, debating this. I mean, some are in pro and some in contra, but I think this is largely irrelevant because we have the ICCPR and other international human rights treaties, and they cover what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights already constituted 60 years ago, but this has been surpassed by binding treaties, so I find it largely academic to discuss whether it's customary law or not. What we are interested in is there an obligation, yes or no? And if I find a treaty, I'm happier.
Excuse my question, that is, how do you define the transparency, whether it means activity or expenses of the financial expenses, and how you define all those things that will cover the transparency? What is the meaning of transparency? How the people have to react on that basis? That is yet to be comment. I request your comment on that.
Yes, I mean, I guess it's referring to your question, to your neighbor's question. As I try to explain, I mean, if I come from a legal background or political background, I mean, there are little international commitments or obligations concerning transparency, in terms of for elections at least. And I would find it difficult to define the term. I mean, I can tell you numerous examples where transparency has been respected in terms of campaign funding or how you display results, whether you have election observation, but that is only for elections. But then you have much more. I mean, you have administrative processes. I mean, to what extent are internal information from administration are public, and to what extent can they display it? I mean, that is largely determined by national legislation, yeah, at least, for example, in Germany. Yeah.
Okay, well, I know there's some individuals still with questions, but we have run out of time, unfortunately. So please join me in a very, very warm round of applause for Dr. Meyer-Ohlendorf.